of food specifically. And so that took me down a pretty deep rabbit hole. And today I want to share where that journey has taken me and what I think are some of the kind of exciting new areas of investigation that we should be thinking about moving forward. So I want to start by talking about the relationship that humans have with fermented foods and how it seems to be unique compared to other animals. So some other animals are documented to consume fermented foods, but it appears to be somewhat infrequent and limited to kind of a narrow range of foods. In contrast, essentially every whole human culture incorporates fermented foods into their diets in some way. And the diversity of foods that are consumed is immense. So all different types of foods are fermented. And of course, beyond just consuming fermented foods, right, humans also direct fermentation. They produce these fermented foods for consumption. And, you know, as a part of this kind of unique relationship that humans have with fermented foods, it's perhaps not surprising to learn that humans have some adaptations associated with the consumption of fermented foods. Now, these technically aren't unique to humans only. These are adaptations that are shared with African apes as well. But in particular, there's two genes that we know about that signal this kind of special relationship with fermented foods in the great ape group of organisms. So the first is the ADH4 gene. We have a special variant of that. It's an alcohol dehydrogenase gene. So it basically lets us break down alcohol more effectively than many other primates. And alcohol, ethanol, of course, is a byproduct of many types of fermentation. So there's three major types of fermentation, and two of them produce ethanol as a byproduct. So being able to break down ethanol is an advantage in terms of being able to consume fermented foods. And the other gene is the HCAR3 gene. And this gene actually codes for a receptor that's thought to actually make humans and great apes more sensitive to signals that come from certain types of microbes, particularly lactobacillus. And lactobacillus are one of the key groups of microbes that's involved in food fermentation. So these two genes, suggest that there's this kind of unique relationship, at least among the African apes and humans, with fermented foods. Now, given this unique relationship between humans and fermented foods, the key questions are when did it emerge and why? So in terms of thinking about when, right, there's actually a really rich archaeological body of evidence that explores this, right? And basically the answer is that it depends on where you are, and what you're using as evidence is what you see as kind of the earliest date that humans have been documented to be using fermented foods. So there's evidence from Greece from 4,300 BC that fermentation of grains was being practiced. In Southeast Asia, Southwest Europe, and Northern Africa. There's evidence from about 7,000 to 6,500 BP that fermentation was being used. In this case, we're looking at pottery shards that are associated with vessels that are thought to be associated with fermentation of dairy products. And then if we go even later, there's evidence that has come relatively recently from Sweden, suggesting that there's fermentation of fish happening in kind of pits. So the fish were buried in pits and fermented there. So we can get relatively far back in the archaeological record in terms of associating humans with fermented food consumption. There are some people, for example, John Speth has posited that there might be even earlier associations between humans and fermented food use. So potentially Neanderthals could have been using fermentation to preserve meat and other types of foods as well. But we don't necessarily have the archaeological evidence for that. I'd like to point out also that if we go beyond the archaeological record and we actually look at those gene variants I was talking about that appear to be adaptations for fermented food consumption, those actually emerged 10 million years ago. So we're talking much earlier than the archaeological record points to or can even record, right? Because we don't have material evidence from that far back. So this is a potentially really ancient association between humans and the common ancestor of humans and other great apes, between fermented foods and our biology. So then a question is why, right? Why did this relationship emerge so early on? And there's a few different ways that we can think about this. Again, if we think about the archaeological record and what's kind of traditionally been considered in terms of what we know about material history, One of the key reasons that's been put forth is food preservation. So food fermentation is an effective way to preserve food. The microbes associated with the fermentation process can outcompete other microbes, and they create byproducts that continue to keep other microbes out of the food. And so they essentially prevent the food from rotting over time. Specifically, these microbes, as they ferment the food, create short chain fatty acids, which lower the pH in the food, and that acid environment makes it really hard for a lot of other types of microbes to exist, to survive there. And after a while, it even makes the microbes themselves that are doing the fermenting unable to survive, and so they die off eventually as well. And so it really is an excellent food preservative. Another hypothesis that's been put forth is that we like the ethanol, right? And that there's this kind of affinity for ethanol. And that in addition to kind of just liking ethanol and the intoxication that comes from it, it helped facilitate social rituals as humans started to settle in communities that were less mobile, and they started to group together in bigger groups, fermenting foods and then drinking the ethanol that came from that could actually help kind of create community in those sorts of situations. Now, the thing I want to point out about both of these hypotheses is that they rely on technology for fermentation that allows people to store the fermented foods, right? Essentially, you need recipients in which you can store those food that you're preserving or store the ethanol that you want to drink later. And so this really is limited to thinking about kind of the archaeological record and when we know that that technology existed in the human species. There are other potential benefits of food fermentation, however, that don't rely on this sort of technology. So in particular, fermented foods are known to have health benefits, both in terms of nutrition and in terms of probiotics and prebiotics. So nutritionally, fermented foods have higher caloric value than other types of foods. They have higher free amino acid content, and they even have higher vitamin contents to some extent. Fermentation is also known to degrade fiber and toxins. So for example, people that have a gluten allergy sometimes find that they're able to consume things like sourdough bread because the fermentation action of the microbes can actually break down some of the gluten compounds before the people consume it. So it essentially gets pre-digested and it's less of an allergy issue. We also know there's foods like blowfish and cassava that need to be fermented before they can be consumed. Otherwise, they're toxic and can really do some damage to people. So there's just these really great nutritional benefits of fermented foods. And then, of course, microbes are doing the fermenting of these foods. And so fermented foods are, by nature, probiotics. They contain live microbes that can be inoculated into the body. And we know that microbes can affect the nutrition of the animals that they're associated with, the immune function, and even the behavior. And then the byproducts of microbial fermentation, like these short-chain fatty acids I referenced earlier, are also known to affect all sorts of aspects of physiology of the animals that consume them or that have them produced inside of them. So short-chain fatty acids can interact, again, with host nutrition, with the immune system, and even the host nervous system. And so because there are these kind of health benefits, either nutritional or otherwise, that don't require the technology associated with storing food or storing ethanol, it seems that the kind of why did humans associate with fermented foods so early on in our evolutionary history seems like it probably has something to do with these health benefits. But that's really easy to sit here and argue, and the question is, how do we test this idea? This is really tricky, actually. So ancient evidence is hard to find, right? So potentially there's no materials associated with fermentation, right? So there can be vessels and things that are used to store foods and ethanol, for example. But as we saw with, for example, the fish pits in Sweden, right? You don't necessarily need those types of recipients in order for food to ferment. And in fact, things like fruit ferment naturally in nature all of the time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that people are not consuming fermented foods if you don't find the technology associated with it. Also, because fermented foods are easier to digest than other types of foods potentially, there's not really a lot of anatomical or physiological adaptations that are required for consuming them, right? So we can look to some of the genes I already talked about, but we would really expect there to be a limited number of genes that we can look at in terms of kind of trying to find the biological evidence. And then finally, the biological or chemical residues associated with fermentation are not necessarily unique and may not preserve all that well. Now, these are all definitely challenges, and there are people that are working on them. And so, the answer to this may change in 5 or 10 years. But for now, it's really difficult to look for ancient evidence, at least in these kind of deep evolutionary timelines. Now, modern evidence is difficult also, because if we think that our common ancestor with other great apes were using fermented foods to the extent that we have these gene variants, these adaptations to it, there's unlikely to be a lot of current variation in those adaptations in modern human populations, right? All humans are probably going to have those adaptations because we all evolved from that last common ancestor. So it's really hard to look at this across human groups as well. And so this is where I would argue that extant primates actually offer a really interesting window into this problem. And while it won't give us, complete resolution on these questions, if we can determine how pervasive the consumption of fermented foods, particularly kind of late stage fermented foods, is by wild primates and the ecological context in which it occurs, then we might be able to start to think about some of the ecological and evolutionary forces that could have driven it in humans and contextualize it within human evolutionary history. And so to that end, I did a study recently, an analysis, where together with more than 40 other primatologists, we compiled qualitative data describing overripe fruit consumption from primate field studies around the world. And so we didn't have chemical data to assess the extent to which these foods were actually fermented chemically. And so we were relying on observations and saying that was clearly an overripe food. It smelled fermented, something that was very obviously late stage fermented and being consumed by these primates. Working together, we were able to pull together data from 40 species of primates inhabiting 50 research sites around the world. And these primate species represented 11 of the 16 primate families. The sites were on all continents that primates inhabit, and the habitats encompass both tropical and temperate climates. We had researchers describe the types of foods they observed these primates consuming, the types of presumably fermented foods that they observed them consuming, the frequency of their use, and any other associated behaviors. And then we also had everybody provide us with a whole range of information about the site and the primates themselves. And we ran generalized linear mixed models to look at the relative importance of these different variables. And so here's just a list of the variables we were looking at, things that we called socio-ecological traits, so things that had to do with the primates, right? What was their diet? How big is their body size? How big are their brains, relatively speaking? We also looked at climatic data, so rainfall, temperature, elevation, latitude, longitude. We used habitat size as kind of a rough measure of habitat quality to try to understand kind of how fragmented the site might be. And then we put sampling effort of essentially how long were these primates observed for. And I'll just say all the studies were 9 months in length at minimum, and the median study length was 15 months that each primate group was observed for. So to jump right in and show you what we found 15 primate species, which is a little bit more than a third of the species we had data from, that were seen consuming these clearly late stage fermented foods. The foods were overwhelmingly fruit, presumably because fruit ferment easily in nature, and it's also easy for us to observe that. It's much harder for us to observe fermented nectar, even though it may exist and likely does exist in flowers that some of these primates consume. There was no clear phylogenetic bias. Primates all across the order were observed to do this, as well as all across the world at about 23 study sites in 12 countries. And generally speaking, if you look at the second to last column in this table, this is the number of fruits that these primates were observed consuming in these late stages of fermentation. And so there's a few primates, such as spider monkeys, Ateles geoffroyi, the third row here, as well as capuchins, Thebus imitator, and a few other primates throughout that are consuming, 7, 8, 9 types of fermented fruits. Most of the primates consume between 1 and 3 different species of fermented fruits. So it was really limited, generally speaking, to a small subset of fruits. And that last column, percent TFT, is percent of total feeding time. And so you can see it's generally speaking a very small amount of the total feeding time during a given year. So, anywhere from 0.1% to maybe 5% of total feeding time. Although I will say that in some cases, such as with the white-faced capuchins and the brown howler monkey, Cebus imitator, and Alawata guariba, up to 15% of the feeding time could be dedicated to that food item during a specific season when it was available. The context in which this happened tended to vary. In some cases, though, it was reported that this was observed after a patch had been depleted. So, for example, orangutans would consume these overripe fruits if there were no other fruits left in that fruit patch. And for example, for the brown howler monkey and the spider monkey, in 2 of the sites, it was reported that this type of behavior occurred during periods of altered food availability. So there wasn't as much of kind of the preferred food available. Another interesting thing to point out is that 31 of the 44 fruit species that were reported to be consumed in this late stage of fermentation appear to have some sort of defense against herbivores. And these could be physical defenses like a tough husk or skin that's really hard to break into, or secondary metabolites like alkaloids, acetogens, saponins, and tannins. So things that would otherwise deter these primates from consuming them. It seems that maybe fermentation is allowing the primates to take advantage of some of these fruits because it's breaking down some of those physical defenses and those toxins. I also wanted to point out that there were a few reports of preference for fermented foods and possible incitation. So these primates may have actually been inciting food fermentation. So this is spider monkey, white-faced capuchin, and the lemur here, and they were all reported to actually actively knock fruits out of trees of a specific species and then eat them off of the ground sometime later. In the case of the white-faced capuchin, the capuchins would knock these fruits to the ground and they would come back up to 2 weeks later, and they would not consume these fruits unless they were fermented. They had one of those really tough outer husks, and so the capuchins essentially couldn't get at the fruit unless it was fermented. The spider monkeys and the lemurs would consume the fruits when they were not fermented, but in the case of the lemurs, for example, they would eat the fruits off the ground first if fruits were available both on the ground and in the trees. So this is just some evidence that there may be a preference for some fruits to be consumed fermented, even when regular ripe fruits are available, and that there may actually be some purposeful behavior occurring here, although that's speculative. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is from our models, there were a few key variables that came out as significant predictors of fermented food consumption. Our positive predictors were mean annual maximum temperature and habitat size. So the hotter the habitat and bigger, the more likely fermented food consumption was. And then the negative predictors were mean annual minimum temperature and rainfall. So essentially the higher the annual low temperature, the less fermented food you saw, and the less rain there is, the more fermented food consumption we saw. So it seems like these are habitats that tend to be kind of towards the extreme, even though most primates are living in kind of a more tropical environment. The environments that are kind of more towards that extreme in terms of temperature and rainfall were the environments in which we saw the primates engaging in this behavior more often. And this could be a result of being able to find the fermented foods, right? So for perhaps in hotter temperatures, foods ferment more readily. It's easier to smell the ethanol that's evaporating from them. And perhaps some of these plants are actually more defended, whether again, it's physically or chemically. And so the primates actually need to rely on fermentation to be able to access some of these fruits in these habitats. But those are open questions. So kind of the overall finding from this analysis was that, first of all, fermented food consumption is pretty widespread in non-human primates, right? Certainly not to the degree that we see in humans. But if you think about it, we're really looking at this late stage fermentation, and there certainly are other foods that we weren't able to detect because we didn't analyze them chemically. So this is not necessarily an uncommon behavior in non-human primates, but again, it's not as frequent, and it doesn't involve as diverse an array of foods as it does in humans. But to the point about the health benefits of fermented food, it really does seem that the use of targeted consumption of fermented foods by primates may be part of a broader nutritional strategy to increase food availability and expand the dietary niche. So whether primates are using fermented fruits as kind of a fallback food and eating them when other foods are not available or when they've gotten to a patch too late, or they're consuming them because that particular food would not be edible unless fermentation had broken down some of the plant defenses. Either way, this really does seem to be part of some sort of dietary strategy. So if we go back to thinking about human evolution, it's possible that as we believe the pattern to be based on the data we have right now, in other primates, in humans, fermented foods also could be a source of fallback foods during human evolution. And this has actually been suggested by the authors of the paper that presented that variation of that HCAR gene, that adaptation. Fermented foods also could have increased edibility of things like underground plant storage organs that we think some of our human ancestors relied on relatively heavily as we started to inhabit more open environments. And I'd also argue that we should think about this in terms of grains, right? Wild grains tend to be high in toxins and fibers, and so fermentation may have actually been necessary to make them more edible. And so some of this archaeological evidence that we see associated with grains and we think may actually be a signal of ethanol production could also have just been a fermentation process to, make the grains themselves edible with the ethanol content as kind of the side effect. And of course, I haven't even touched on the other potential health benefits that could be associated with these fermented foods because of their probiotic or prebiotic properties, but that's much harder to address with the data we have right now. And so some key considerations that I think we should start integrating into our perspectives on human evolution and fermented foods is, first of all, humans don't need specialized technology to consume fermented foods. We see this sort of behavior happening in wild non-human primates without any of the types of technologies that we usually associate with fermented food production, or consumption, pardon me, but also production, right? So if we think about if capuchin's knocking some of these fruits out of the trees and coming back later is actually purposeful, right? We could argue that the same sort of thing could have been occurring early in human evolutionary history. And I'd also like to suggest that the consumption and production of these foods could have done things like increased human dietary niche plasticity, right? Allowing humans to consume food items they wouldn't have been able to consume otherwise, potentially because of toxins and other sorts of plant defenses, or may have allowed them to inhabit seasonal environments and use fermented foods as a fallback food. And without that, they wouldn't have been able to survive in those types of environments otherwise. And the energy and nutritional benefits provided by fermented foods could have also altered human energy budgets, right? The amount of energy and nutrients that humans could extract from different environments, which could have affected life history processes like growth and development, for example, brain size, etc. And so I would argue that while things like consumption of meat, cooking, domestication of plants and animals have all been really integrated into our consideration of human evolution and the types of nutritional challenges that humans were likely to have been facing across our evolution. I think fermented foods should also be integrated into these frameworks and theories, and we should really start to think about the potential importance of them more critically. And the last thing I just want to put forward for everybody to kind of think about as we move forward is that Old World monkeys were evolving in kind of similar changing environments at the same time as some of our human ancestors, right? So we're starting to see the climate changing, rainforests are starting to fragment, you're starting to get kind of more open habitats and woodland areas. And Old World monkeys are also inhabiting these types of habitats. And we obviously don't see Old World monkeys fermenting foods the way that humans do. But Cercopithecines, which are one group of Old World monkeys, have cheek pouches that contribute to the pre-digestion of food. So it's been argued that these cheek pouches have evolved as a result of food competition. So essentially they allow these monkeys to stuff food in their mouth and then run away and eat it later. So that's avoiding food competition. But these food pouches in their cheeks also actually have huge enzyme activity and can break down these foods that are in the cheek pouches really, really quickly. And so there is this kind of pre-digestion fermentation that happens in the cheek pouches. And it's interestingly quite analogous to some of the human fermented food practices, right? So if we think about things like chicha, where people are chewing up foods to start the fermentation process and then finishing the fermentation process in recipients, right? But this isn't actually that different than kind of the beginnings of some of the human fermented food production processes. And so I think it's really interesting to think about whether directed fermentation by humans and cheek pouch predigestion by cercopithecines could represent similar dietary strategies for these primates that were inhabiting these kind of similar environments that were nutritionally challenging and may have presented obstacles in terms of seasonality of foods or the defenses associated with plant underground storage organs, et cetera. These could actually be convergent strategies. And I'll just throw out there that to the extent that the gut microbiome tells us something about the physiology and ecology of the hosts associated with, microbiome data from humans, apes, and cercopithecines suggests that there could actually be this sort of convergence. So when we look at the gut microbiome of apes here in brown, humans here in orange, and cercopithecines in teal, you can see very clearly that the gut microbiomes of cercopithecines are more similar to that of humans than apes are, other apes, non-human apes. And we do think that these microbiome signals are very closely tied to physiology and diet and ecology. And so it's interesting to me to think about whether some of this signal of similarity in the gut microbiome could be results of this kind of convergent predigestion strategy that humans and cercopithecines are engaging in. So with that, I will thank the many co-authors that contributed to pulling together all of those primate data from the primate field studies, as well as my department and my lab group specifically. And I'm happy to take any questions.